In a 2005 symposium, the FBI defined a serial killer as an individual or individuals that unlawfully kill two or more victims in separate events. Over our world's dark history, there have been a great number of people that fall under this definition. Evil people who commit one of the darkest acts a person can perpetrate against another. There are killers known for their large body count, or those that are remembered for their cruelty. But today, we will be discussing two serial killers characterized by their intense greed and disregard for human life. Two body snatchers that took it a grisly step further, one of which whose own skeleton and death mask are still displayed at the Anatomical Museum at the University of Edinburgh. Men whose names were William Burke and William Hare. Burke, also known as Brendan Dines Burke, was born in 1792 in Ireland, and after finishing his studies, joined a unit in the militia which later disbanded after 7 years. He then worked as a servant to a landlord, but in 1817 he made his way to Scotland, leaving his wife and 2 children behind, never to return. Certainly off to a great start with that, but let's continue. He began working in Scotland as a construction worker for the Union Canal, where he met one Helen McDougall. Shortly after meeting this new romantic interest, despite the fact that this man had an entire wife and children back in Ireland, he abandoned his construction work and took up various odd jobs. Yes, Burke was a man who wore many hats, to include a laborer, a weaver, a baker, a cobbler, and later still, a serial killer. Though, to be fair, he did finally settle on a career as a shoemaker, which, fun fact, is called a cordwainer. By the year 1827, Burke and his lady love McDougall had been living together as common-law spouses for 3 years. Super cute, I know. During this time, they moved to Tanner's Close, where he would meet someone whose life and destiny would become inextricably linked with his through the grim acts they took part in as a team. This newfound friend was named William Hare, and after Burke and McDougall moved into a lodging house run by his wife Margaret Hare, the Westport area of Edinburgh would be plagued by a string of murders. There's a lot of debate about why William Burke would have done the things he did. Here was a man that was described as charming, stable, outgoing, and best of all, literate. I mean, that was pretty much the most you could ask for at that time. So why did he risk and then later lose it all? Was it just for the meager money he made? Perhaps it was the thrill of being the last face his innocent, terrified victims saw. Whatever the reasoning, he was a selfish, cruel man who, in the end, deserved every punishment and humiliation he received. It would be naive to say that Burke alone masterminded this criminal enterprise. Most people tend to agree that the brains behind their operation was actually Hare himself, though he received a much lighter sentence in the end. He was born somewhere around 1792 or 1804. Records are not very clear, but what is known for certain is that, like Burke, Hare was a navvy, or laborer employed in the excavation and construction of a road, railroad, or canal. What canal in particular? Why, the Union Canal, of course. When Hare later moved to Edinburgh, he met a man who ran a lodging house named Logue. Hare, being the trusted and wonderful friend that he is, married Logue's widow after he died in 1826. Margaret Laird, now Margaret Hare, maintained her work in the lodging house while Hare continued his construction work on the canal. I think we can all see where this is going, right? Instead of these two men enjoying their rather privileged and relatively stable life for that time, they decided it wasn't enough. For just a few extra coins to weigh down their pockets, they would illegally sell over 17 bodies, ending the lives of at least 16 of those people themselves. In the end, this murderous duo would be held responsible for the deaths of 12 women, 3 men, and 1 child. May they all rest in peace. The first body sold by the 2 men was not the product of murder. In fact, it was an elderly army pensioner named Donald who died of dropsy while living in the lodge house. Dropsy is another term for hydropsy or fluid retention. Common causes include heart and kidney problems, low protein, venous insufficiency, or deep vein thrombosis. Death was not a good enough reason, apparently, to dismiss this man's debt. He owned £4 in back rent, and an angry, slighted Hare plotted with Burke to sell his body to a surgeon named Robert Knox. Knox was a freelance teacher that educated private students on the wonders contained within the human body. The only problem being that there were not enough bodies around to keep him in business. This all changed when our 2 plucky BFFLs came knocking with the answer to his prayers. The pair stole Donald's body from a coffin paid for by the local parish and filled it with bark before resealing it and hiding his corpse under a bed at the lodging house. After making their first sale, Burke and Hare realized what a lucrative business this could be. What, may you ask, was the price of his body? What was the return for keeping this innocent man from his final resting place? It was a whopping £7 and 10 shillings, approximately $600 today, if my conversions are correct, though. Listen, I'm not a historian or a mathematician, so please don't come for me if I'm wrong, okay? I'm doing my best over here. I didn't finish college. They split this amount fairly. Burke received £3 and 5 shillings, and Hare received £4 and 5 shillings, to recover the loss on poor Donald's rent, of course. According to later testimony, as the pair were leaving, one of Knox's assistants made a remark about being, quote, glad to see them again when they had another to dispose of. Hare and Burke decided that they couldn't just wait around for another sick individual to die naturally, so the 2 began scheming. At first, they tried to kill people with no friends or family. People they thought had no one to miss them when they never returned from that cursed room. You see, their preferred method of obtaining, quote, new subjects was to lure them to Hare's lodge, feed them alcohol until they couldn't fight back, then hold their noses and mouths shut while sitting on their chest, effectively suffocating them and leaving a relatively mark-free body to sell to good old Knox. This process is actually still to this day called burking. The quality of the body was important because the better the condition, the more coin they would receive for their morbid work. Most serial killers space their crimes out by months or even years, but these 2 were impatient and wanted as much money as they could get as fast as possible. The total time of their crime spree was just under 1 year. Unfortunately, an exactly correct timeline for all of their murders doesn't exist, due to a number of reasons, one of which being Burke and Hare providing mismatched confessions after the pair was caught, but I will try to summarize for you what I can. It was January or February of 1828, and a miller named Joseph found himself at the mercy of these 2 evil men while he was living at the lodge house. Many people believe that it is more likely Joseph was the first due to his proximity and ease of access, as well as the fact that he was suffering from deliriousness brought on by a severe fever. Feigning kindness, Hare provided him whiskey before placing a pillow over his face, then held it there, and held it there, and held it there, until Joseph could hold on no longer. Burke lay across the man's chest with his entire body weight while this occurred, and the 2 quickly delivered his corpse to Knox. Their next victim was Abigail Simpson, a local salt seller. They murdered her in cold blood in much the same way as they did Joseph the Miller. Hare suffocated the poor woman with a pillow, while Burke laid across her chest in the lodge, which was quickly becoming a house of horrors. Often the two were unable to sell the corpse right away and had to wait until the darkness of night. They would callously shove the body under the bed, hiding it until a more opportune time came when they could move the evidence of their crime. This would ultimately be their downfall. Their next victim was an unnamed Englishman who, unfortunately, found himself staying at the lodge house we are becoming all too familiar with. This man was just trying to survive, selling matches and tinder, but unfortunately falling ill with jaundice, which left him vulnerable. They would have done much the same, either holding a pillow over his head or just using their bare hands to prevent him from breathing out of his mouth and nose. Always, one of them would lay their crushing body weight on the victim's chest to ensure that they never left that home alive ever again. Hare would claim that his fear of what effect all of these ill lodgers might have on the business is what truly inspired him to do away with them and, of course, make a little profit on the side. As the two men became familiar faces to Knox and his students, they would often exchange friendly conversation. Burke would actually go on to testify that, quote, Dr. Knox approved of its being so fresh, in relation to the bodies, but that he, quote, did not ask any questions. As the weeks progressed, so too did their trail of bodies. Unfortunately, we do not know the name of their next victim either, but in February or March of that year, Margaret Hare would actually invite an old woman to the lodge house. She was given enough whiskey to make her fall asleep, once again, all by Margaret Hare. She abandoned the defenseless and unconscious woman there in the lion's den, and when her husband returned home in the afternoon, he placed a stiff mattress cover over her mouth and nose, then left her alone. As the sun faded from the sky, this poor, unnamed woman took her last strained breaths, and by nightfall she was dead. Her body was worth 10 pounds to Knox, but her life was all but worthless to Hare and Burke. Burke was not the most loyal of men to the women in his life. I mean, duh, he straight up abandoned his wife and 2 children in Ireland, so no surprise there. However, Helen McDougall was certainly in for a surprise when, in early April, she visited her brother-in-law Constantine's house, only to find her man talking up a woman named Janet Brown while an intoxicated Mary Patterson lay passed out at the table. Burke had met the 2 women at a local tavern, and after so kindly buying them drinks, invited them over for a spot of breakfast at his lodging. Instead of going there, they ended up making the journey to his brother's house with 2 bottles of whiskey in hand. His brother was like, "Hey dude, I have to actually go to work and make an honest living, so I'm out, but please enjoy my crib while I'm gone. My only rule is that you don't commit homicide here. Have fun!" We all know how this story ends, but before any murdering took place, Helen found the 3 and attacked Burke, accusing him of having an affair. Janet Brown insisted she had no idea that Burke was married, and she fled the premises, leaving Patterson behind, still passed out at the table. McDougall followed suit and left, but returned shortly with Hare and his wife in tow. The 2 men locked their wives out and proceeded to kill the unconscious woman before selling her body in a tea chest that afternoon in broad daylight for 8 pounds. Not one to waste an opportunity, McDougall decided that Patterson's petticoats and skirts would look just darling on her figure, and she kept them. Knox was described as being delighted with the corpse, despite it still being warm when it was presented to him. He kept poor Mary Patterson in whiskey for 3 months before dissecting her, and Janet Brown later returned, looking for her friend in vain, but was told she had accompanied a traveling salesman to Glasgow. Mrs. Haldane was the next to fall victim to Burke and Hare after falling asleep in the stables of the lodge house, heavily intoxicated. They made quick work of her, ever the opportunist, and sold her to Knox. Then, some months later, Mrs. Haldane's daughter, referred to in some records as Peggy and some as Margaret, lodged at Hare's home as well. She and Burke drank together well into the night before he alone killed her and sold her body for £8. Burke began to take the initiative on his own more often after that, and would kill another elderly female lodger in May of that same year without Hare being present. They sold her body to Knox for £8. After this killing, they began to branch out, and their next victim would actually be familiar to Burke as she had sold him scraps of leather in the past. Effie was known as a cinder gatherer and made a meager living, scavenging through other people's rubbish and selling whatever small treasures she could find. She would have lived a rough life, and after being lured into the stables with whiskey, endured a rough death as well. She padded their pockets with an extra £10. I don't know if you can tell, but I hate these two men, and I hope they live the rest of their lives with hemorrhoids and foot sores. Burke then discovered his next victim out on the streets, too drunk to stand. The sad part here is she was already being escorted home by a constable, but Burke managed to convince him to release the woman into his custody and ensured the policeman that she would get home safely. She did not, and her body was purchased by Knox for £10. Their violence and cruelty increased with every life they snuffed out too soon, but I am especially heartbroken about their next victims. An elderly woman and her grandson who lodged at the Hare house. The boy, who Burke described as dumb because he's an asshole, was left to sit by the kitchen fire alone as he and Hare murdered his grandmother in the bedroom. After that grisly deed was completed, they dragged the young boy into the same room his grandmother had just met her demise and suffocated him. I don't know if he saw his grandmother's body, but I know that he was terrified and he fought back, but was no match for the two adult men's strength. Burke said he was haunted by the boy's expression, and that murder had disturbed him most of all. And my solution to that would be, hey, don't fucking murder people, especially kids, you stupid, evil, disgust. As if that wasn't enough, their bodies would not fit into the small tea chest that Burke and Hare would often use to transport their victims to an eagerly waiting Knox. They shoved their bodies into a herring barrel. Herring is a type of fish, just in case anyone didn't know, and attempted to load the container onto a cart, but Hare's horse outright refused to pull the cart and forced them to hire a porter to assist with the transport. If you didn't hate them enough already, Hare, enraged at this poor animal's stubbornness, shot it dead in the yard after returning from selling the bodies. That's right, he shot a healthy, innocent animal after killing a healthy, innocent child and his grandmother. Yeah, you could say that they are huge pieces of shit. I certainly do. In June, Burke and McDougall left Edinburgh for a short time to visit her father, leaving Hare and his wife to their own devices. According to Burke, despite all the extra income they had been receiving over the last few months, Hare was not doing well financially and had even pawned some of their belongings. When they returned from their trip, however, Hare seemed to be doing just fine with new clothes and extra coins jingling in his pocket. Infuriated, Burke asked if Hare had sold another body without him, and when he denied this, Burke checked with his good old friend Knox, who gladly confirmed he had purchased a woman's body from Hare for £8. This was just all too much for their friendship, and they actually physically fought over this before Burke and McDougall left the lodging house to stay with a cousin who lived close by. But of course, these two best friends just couldn't stay away from one another for too long, and to patch up their friendship after their little tiff, they murdered a washerwoman named Mrs. Ostler, sometimes also referred to as Mrs. Hostler. This lady legitimately just came over to do her job and wash their linens, and they paid her back by murdering her and selling her for £8. Their next victim was Anne Dougall, or McDougall. Sound familiar? It should, because she was actually one of Helen McDougall's relatives. And later, Margaret Hare actually suggested that the men kill Helen next because, according to her, they could not trust a Scotch woman. That's how it's spelt. Scotch, not Scot, but I don't know. This is all according to Burke, however, and cannot be proven 100% that Margaret did indeed say this, though I personally wouldn't put it past her. After Anne, their next victim would be the beginning of the end, though he was not the last person they murdered. The word I'm going to use here is not kind, nor is it an appropriate word to use for someone who has mental difficulties or developmental delays and does not in any way reflect my opinions. I'm only saying this to remain true to the history, but again, this is not a kind word. 18-year-old James Wilson, or Daft Jamie, as he was referred to by the people of Edinburgh, would be the next person whose life was tragically cut short. Jamie was developmentally disabled and walked with a limp due to disfigurement on his feet, and he was actually rather well known in the area, so people really began talking after he went missing. Jamie lived on the streets and survived by begging, but was lured to the lodge by Hare. At his insistence, his wife Margaret went to fetch Burke, locking them in the room and sliding the key to her husband under the door. Jamie was strong and not as intoxicated as their other victims had been because he did not really like whiskey. So he fought with all the strength in his young body to survive, but he did not succeed and was murdered by both Burke and Hare before being stripped of the few possessions he had in this world. The next day, some of Knox's students would actually claim to recognize the face of Jamie Wilson, but Knox insisted it was no one they could have ever possibly known, and to avoid suspicion, removed his feet and head before dissecting his body ahead of all the others filling his storage. Yeah, and this dude claims to have known nothing about the murders. Okay. I'm really sorry if I pronounce the next victim's name incorrectly. I tried to research how to pronounce it, and apparently there's like 10,000 different ways you can pronounce this one name, so I'm going to do my best. It was now October 31st, 1828, and Burke lured a middle-aged Irish woman named Margaret Daugherty into a different lodging house under the pretext that his own sweet old mother hailed from the same area in Ireland, and get this, also once had the surname of Daugherty before marrying. This was a lie, of course, but they struck up a conversation, drinking, laughing, and even dancing, until Burke left Daugherty with McDougall, claiming he was going to get more whiskey for them to enjoy. Really, he was telling Hare to come over and assist with his plan to murder her. The only setback was the other couple staying at this lodging house, called the Brogan Lodging House. They paid Anne and James Gray to instead stay at the Hare lodging house and lied, saying that Daugherty was a relative of theirs that they wanted to spend personal time with. It had been so long since they had seen her, you see. The party went on and became wilder and more fueled by whiskey. Burke and Hare actually physically fought during the night, but reconciled enough to murder Daugherty before stashing her body in a pile of straw at the end of her bed. We know that this was absolutely a violent attack because Daugherty's blood could be seen in a number of places throughout the room. All seemed to be going to plan for the duo, and they left her body there until the next morning, planning on selling her when they had the opportunity. They were not expecting Anne Gray to return the next day, asking to search the room for her stockings that had accidentally been left the night before. She became suspicious when Burke would not allow her anywhere near to search for her belongings, and the couple later returned when the house was empty, only to discover Daugherty's body still hidden in the pile of hay. Her face was smeared in a mix of saliva and blood, and they immediately left to alert the authorities. They happened to run into McDougall, who attempted unsuccessfully to bribe them into forgetting what they had seen, but police soon showed up to search the home. Though they had at that point already brought the body to Knox, the police found her blood-soaked clothing under the bed and brought Burke and his wife in for questioning. They claimed that Daugherty had left and they had no idea where she went, but provided different times for when she would have made this alleged departure, and the police, already suspicious, decided to search Knox's dissecting rooms the next day, where they made a horrific discovery. James Gray confirmed that one of the bodies was indeed that of Margaret Daugherty, and Hare, his wife, and even poor Brogan, the owner of the other lodging house, were all arrested despite denying having any knowledge of what had occurred. Brogan was, of course, released quickly when they discovered he truly took no part in the violent offense, but the famous foursome was separated and interrogated. All four gave conflicting reports, and the investigators began the long, arduous process of determining just how many victims there were and what charges they could bring against these heartless monsters. I am still shocked to my core that our resident butcher and bullshitter Dr. Knox never faced any legal issues for his part in this dark enterprise. But though investigators said he was, quote, deficient in heart and principle, they stated he had not broken the law to his knowledge or theirs. He told police that Burke and Hare had spun a story about purchasing bodies from local lodging houses when they passed from natural causes. Burials were expensive, and when no one stepped forward, eager to pay the price for interment, the two men would swoop in and bring the bodies to Knox and his students for study. I personally think that Knox knew what was going on, or at least knew more than he claimed, but he never questioned anything while people continued to die violently all around him, and he never said a damn word. There was a huge roadblock in the investigation, and that was the lack of bodies. Remember, these two were not just disposing of bodies or hiding them where they wouldn't be discovered. They sold these people to a surgeon that took them apart and disposed of them for the murderers. The only body they really had to rely on was Margaret Daugherty's, and Robert Christison, along with William Newbigging, two acclaimed forensic investigators of the time, examined her remains, determining her cause of death to most likely be forced suffocation and allowing the police to arrest and charge them all with murder. Unfortunately, as the media and public often do, false stories and allegations began being published and exchanged by the populace until almost every single missing person was thought to be a victim of this crime. This no doubt slowed the process and muddied the waters of what was already a confounding and complicated story, but some information passed along to the police ended up actually being quite helpful. Janet Brown would go on to confirm and identify articles of clothing belonging to her deceased friend Mary Patterson, and a local baker would tell police he had seen Burke's nephew wearing the same pants Jamie Wilson was last seen in. There is a legal proceeding referred to as turning state's evidence, or in this case, turning king's evidence, which is essentially to say that a guilty party will provide information and testimony against co-conspirators in return for exoneration or leniency. Hare was the lucky duck that was chosen for this, and without any pressure applied, he began to sing like a canary. How many bird jokes do you think I can make in one sentence? This meant, however, that his wife Margaret would also gain immunity because Hare could not testify against his own wife. So Burke and MacDougall alone faced the music. Hare would make a complete confession on every single murder, and on December 4th, formal charges were filed for the murders of Margaret Daugherty, James Wilson, and Mary Patterson. Up the close and down the stair, but the ben wi' Burke and Hare. Burke's the butcher, Hare's the thief, knocks the boy that buys the beef. This haunting rhyme echoed in the streets as the trial date got closer and closer, before finally beginning at 10 a.m. on December 24th, 1828. A large crowd gathered in the courtroom and outside of the Parliament House, eager to see the two brought to justice for the horrific crimes they had committed. After a lengthy and honestly quite convoluted trial in which Margaret Hare testified while holding her infant who was suffering from whooping cough as an excuse to gain more time to think while answering questions, Mom of the Year award right here, Burke was found guilty of murder and sentenced to death while Margaret was acquitted. Lord Justice Clerk David Boyle, who presided over the case and condemned Burke to death, said to the guilty man, "Your body should be publicly dissected and anatomized, and I trust that if it is ever customary to preserve skeletons, yours will be preserved in order that posterity may keep in remembrance your atrocious crimes." Wow, scathing and well-deserved. It was a bright and beautiful morning on January 8th, 1829. In front of an enormous gathering of people, reportedly over 25,000 in fact, Burke was hanged by the neck until dead. Then on February 1st, he was publicly dissected in a procedure that took 2 hours. Today, Burke's skeleton is still on display at the Edinburgh Medical School. You can find his death mask at Surgeons Hall Museum, along with a book that is said to be bound in his flesh. As for the rest of the sordid characters, they scattered to the wind. Margaret Hare made her way to Ireland after being attacked, and not much is known about what happened to her there. William Hare left Edinburgh as well, but was attacked in Dumfries before being secretly sent towards the English border. It is not known where he went after this. Helen MacDougall was, you guessed it, also attacked and escaped out of Edinburgh, where history lost sight of her. Knox never made any statements to the public regarding his involvement, and though he was technically cleared of any wrongdoing, he was still villainized by the public and even fell out of favor with friends and colleagues. Everything that had once been held so dear to him was gone, and he later died in 1862. Unfortunately, the violence didn't stop with them. After 2 copycat murderers, nicknamed the London Burkers, were hanged in December of 1831 for murdering a 14-year-old boy and attempting to sell his corpse to the King's College in London, the Anatomy Act of 1832 was passed. This, in essence, gave doctors, teachers, and medical students the freedom to dissect donated bodies obtained by official means in an effort to put an end to the illegal corpse trade. Though we do not know a lot about the victims we discussed here today, and most we do not even know their names, they were still people who lived, who were real, who were loved. Donald, the army pensioner, Joseph, the miller, Abigail Simpson, unnamed Englishman, unnamed woman, Mary Patterson, Mrs. Haldane, Peggy or Margaret Haldane, unnamed elderly woman. Effie, the cinder gatherer, unnamed woman taken from the constable. Unnamed woman murdered and sold by Hare, unconfirmed. Unnamed grandmother. Unnamed grandson. Mrs. Ostler. Anne Dougall. James Wilson. Margaret Daugherty.